A spectre is haunting the Conservative Party. It's the spectre of Margaret Thatcher. In every debate, her authority is invoked. In the wardrobe of every female MP lurks the imitation pussy bow blouse. And in every political battle, many Tories ask themselves, what would Maggie do? And if it's a question of resolution, courage, strategic skill, then I'm all for asking that question. But if we're looking at the particular economic conditions that we face today, then it is entirely the wrong question. The problem is that Margaret Thatcher's long shadow has allowed politicians to avoid the questions that they should be asking. In Thatcher's day, the problems that we faced, the main problem we faced was the overbearing presence of uncompetitive, union-ruled, state-owned industries, sucking the life out of the economy and making it impossible to bring down inflation and regain competitiveness. The main problems we face today and the landscape we face is very different. Everything that could be privatized has been. Services have improved upon the dire state they were in the 70s, but the regulatory system set up to supervise all these privatized assets hasn't exactly proved itself hugely capable of thinking and planning ahead for the problems that we face and being a good steward of our national interests. And we face a new set of problems: national security problems, chronic underinvestment, and global state-subsidized competition. And the subsidies are no longer just from China or other Asian economies, as has been the case for several decades. They're now ramping up from our closest allies and rivals, the United States, the European Union, and others soon to follow on a similar scale. So in a bid to break out of the low-growth stasis that the developed world has been in since the financial crisis, and having observed Asia's success, Western countries are now turning back to the state to see if its power can be deployed to revive our fortunes. This has been very disturbing to a generation of conservatives raised upon a diet of Thatcherisms about the inviolability of free trade and the failures of the state. And so instead of action, confusion reigns. The reflexes of the 80s are too ingrained, and MPs are finding themselves unable to adapt. They're still too focused on a debate about what the state should and shouldn't do, and not on how it can do things effectively, where it does things. And so Britain is now almost alone in doing nothing of any scale to help our high-tech strategic industries thrive. And if this continues, the long-term effects are going to be catastrophic. So I will give you an example. It's one I wrote about last week, and I'm sorry if you've read it, but I think it is a very powerful example and the most powerful one that I've come across. Near Huntingdon in Cambridgeshire, there's a small British company called Paragraph, a high-tech producer of semiconductors, electronic or computer chips, which are now in basically everything that we use, or all modern products. Paragraph was spun out of Cambridge University a few years ago. It employs about 112 people on 2 sites, and in the world of semiconductors, it's a minnow. But it is the only company in the world that has so far worked out how to produce semiconductors using graphene. This means its chips are much, much more sensitive and much more energy efficient than any other semiconductors in the world. And to give you an idea of how seriously other countries take this kind of technology, Beijing recently established an $80 billion fund to crack exactly the niche of graphene semiconductors that Paragraph is in. The US is putting more than $50 billion into domestic semiconductor production. The EU is putting 40 billion euros. So what about over here? Well, recently, Paragraph applied for an investment from the state-owned UK Infrastructure Bank for an investment worth in the tens of millions, so on a tiny scale compared to what's going on in the world. It was rejected on the grounds that there's plenty of private capital for this sort of thing. The state doesn't need to get involved. So not only is its cost of capital much, much higher than its rivals is going to be, it also faces a whole other load of problems involving the government. It wants to expand by hiring more staff, but even when it finds a physicist or an engineer prepared to move to the UK, it has to wait 9 months for the government to process a visa. I think even most of us who want immigration to go down overall would say we probably do want semiconductor engineers to be able to come here and work. The company wants to scale up production, but the local council won't organise the grid to put in a proper electricity substation to actually get power into its warehouse. So it's taken 6 months and £1 million of its own money just to get connected so it can even start procuring the equipment it needs. Why is this happening? Because Conservatives have forgotten that fostering national growth isn't purely about getting the state out of the way. It is also about making the state work effectively. Pleas for an industrial strategy to improve national security and prosperity fall on deaf ears because these ears are attuned only to one way of looking at the world that made sense 40 years ago. Those ears seemed completely unable to distinguish between an industrial strategy that would help new cutting-edge strategic firms and the National Coal Board. So we in this room are generally quite familiar with examples of state largesse and incompetence, but we're looking at history with one eye closed. So for the second part of my talk, I want to present 3 brief examples of where state intervention has produced stellar economic transformation. And my first example is in the emergence of Silicon Valley. Semiconductors were invented in the 1950s to solve problems caused by bulky, slow, and unreliable computer systems. But in making something far better than what went before, the first chip makers faced the huge problem of who exactly was going to fund the production and buy the products. Nothing and no one used computer chips back then. But thankfully, commercial salvation arrived in the form of a contract with NASA. The Apollo program that eventually took the first men to the moon was the first showcase of what computer chips could do. And as the space race and the Cold War intensified, the Pentagon soon got interested as well. And it was these early government contracts that funded the development of an entire Silicon Valley that could then eventually pivot to commercial production, to the industry that we know today, and enable the computerization of basically everything. Without the state's buying power, none of this could have happened. Second example. In 2014, Edward Snowden fled the US with more than 1 million documents on the NSA's spying programs and leaked them to the world. We know roughly what happened in the West, but it also led to a huge change of policy in China. The lesson that Beijing took from the Snowden files was that China was much too dependent upon US technology, and this represented a huge security threat. Xi Jinping's response was to establish a program called Made in China 2025, which used a set of state investment funds called guidance funds to plow $1 trillion into new technologies. Unlike past, largely wasteful state investment programs, these funds actually had a profit target, and they hired people from the private sector to administer them. This meant that although many of them obviously did succumb to bad habits and waste funds, many of them were hugely successful. And one standout example was the funding of a battery company called NIO by a fund run by the regional government of Hefei in 2020. Back then, NII didn't seem to have much of a future. It was struggling, and Tesla was way ahead in terms of electric vehicle battery production. 3 years later, NIO has overtaken Tesla. The state-owned fund has made a return of 5.5 times its original investment, and the battery production in its province is now attracting commercial private investment from the likes of Volkswagen. Not bad for a Communist Party dabble in venture capital. Third example comes from closer to home. The UK's vaccine task force. Now, most of us didn't recognize it at the time, but the vaccine task force may just be this country's most successful experiment in industrial policy ever. The task force was essentially a government procurement scheme that de-risked investments made by pharmaceutical companies in untested vaccines. The government agreed to buy a certain amount and fast-track regulatory approval. The companies agreed to accelerate research and production. Under the leadership of a stellar private sector figure, Kate Bingham, The task force built a diversified portfolio of vaccines according to an early assessment of their chance of success. And the result was the second fastest vaccine rollout in the world. So, what should we draw from these examples? Well, yes, the state can waste billions on trying to hold back the tide, but if it does its job well, it can also provide the spark that prompts an economic leap forwards and the revival of competitiveness. It can restore national security at the same time, or improve national security. And there's an endless diversity of tools to choose from. In this country, for example, a policy aimed at massively lowering energy costs would be a start, not decimating the North Sea industry, for example, with repeated windfall taxes that are going to chase investment away. And directing credit towards lowering the costs of key targets, rather than directing it endlessly into housing, which our regulatory and tax system do at the moment, attaching the right conditions to the deployment of this credit to reduce the chance that it's wasted, supporting the right infrastructure, like substations and others, having the right migration policy, having the right incentives to offer university degrees that are actually relevant to the skills we need, offering the right tax breaks, using procurement policy, and yes, subsidies as well. The point is that we need to not only learn from others, but we can then use these examples to fine-tune all of these tools to suit the national conditions that exist in this country. So why is this a conservative policy? Why is this a national conservative priority? Because conservatives should be highly skeptical of sweeping universalist statements like free trade is always best or the state should never intervene. We know that countries and nations develop organically, that they have unique circumstances and interests. And we know that we have to respond accordingly with the tools that we have available. And we also know that around the world at the moment, we are aligned with the interests of our allies who are significantly changing their economic models in response to national security threats. And this is an opportunity and an imperative for us. In other words, the world is adapting. We should not sit this out. We need to adapt too. Instead of slavishly following a distorted view over a debate about what Thatcher would or wouldn't have done faced with our challenges, it's time to pivot, to embrace a new kind of industrial policy and to let the Iron Lady rest in peace.